Now it's time for our tech tip presented by SBT, the world's largest remanufacturer of personal watercraft engines.
Today we're going to talk about crankshafts and how to make them last, which includes shoeing, welding, balancing, phasing, and proper installation of the crankshaft. Let's take a look at some of the parts of our crankshaft. First we have our crank web, which is the main body of the crankshaft. Attached to one of our crank webs is our center pin. The center pin runs through the center of the crankshaft and ties our webs together. Then we have our crank pin, which runs through the crankshaft and connects our connecting rod to the crankshaft. Here is our connecting rod, which is attached to the crankshaft and will eventually be attached to the piston. On either side of the connecting rod, we have these thrust washers, which go between the connecting rod and the crankshaft to make sure that the crankshaft doesn't eat into the connecting rod, or vice versa. Lastly, we have our main bearing, which goes on either end of the crankshaft and in the center in order to support the crankshaft in the engine. So as you can see, a two-stroke crankshaft is really just an assemblage of parts pressed together under tons of hydraulic pressure. When we press this together, we need to make sure that our crank is phased, which means that these crank pins are 180 degrees apart for a two-cylinder and 120 degrees apart for a three-cylinder. And we make sure it stays that way by welding both our crank pins and our center pins. This used to be a race-only option, but we feel it's good for everybody. Once we press the crankshaft together, it needs to be true. True meaning that the crankshaft is straight from one end to the other. We accomplish this by putting the crankshaft in a V-block and using a dial indicator. For a two-cylinder crankshaft, we're allowed no more than 0.02 of an inch. So when we rotate the crankshaft, that needle should move no more than 2 lines. As you can see, this needle is moving less than 1/1000th of an inch. Now that we have a good crankshaft, we want to install it into our engine. Before we do that, we need to install our seals. What we need is some grease on our inside lip. We want to use a wheel bearing grease for that. That works just fine. Once you grease the seals, you need to install it onto the end of the crankshaft. Make sure that you install the seals in the correct direction, because the seals will go on either way, and it does matter. So refer to your manual to make sure they are in the correct position. Next thing we need to do is make sure that all of our pins on our bearing are facing straight up. Not every crankshaft has pins, but most of them do. Now that I have my pins in the correct position, I'm going to take my crankshaft and set it actually into the top part of my crankcase. Once I have it set in, I make sure that my locating rings are in the right place. Then I want to make sure that my pins are in their little pockets in the crankcase. So I'll rotate the bearing until the pin slides into the pocket. The next thing we need to do is install a sealing compound to our crankcase mating surface. We want to completely cover the mating surface all the way up to the bearings and seals. Once we've done that, we can now install the bottom part of our crankcase onto our crankshaft and bolt it down. Doing it this way will ensure an airtight crankcase that will last you for years.